Hello everyone, welcome one and all. I am Assistant Professor Sunena Jadhav, Commerce Department from Sri Pancham Khemraj Mahavidyalaya Savantwadi. For S5 BCom Semester 3 Management Accounting, last lecture we have discussed about the balance sheet ratios and income statement ratios. Today we are going to learn next part of the ratios, that is the combined ratios. Combined ratios is also called interstatement ratios. Relate two atoms or two groups of atoms of which one is from balance sheet and one of the revenue statement. In balance sheet ratios we have seen, for calculation of balance sheet ratios we think two parts, two aspects from the balance sheet, and in revenue statement ratios we have seen we take two aspects, two factors from a revenue statement. And last part is the combined ratio. For calculation of combined ratio, two atoms or two factors, two groups, we consider one from balance sheet or income statement and another from balance sheet or income statement. Means one aspect from income statement and second aspect from balance sheet, and that ratio is known as the combined ratio. This is the first combined ratio. First ratio is a return on capital employed. Okay, a return on capital employed. For calculation of return on capital employed, the formula is used, that is profit before interest, tax and dividend. Okay, PBI. PBI means profit before interest, tax and dividend divided by capital employed into 100. This is the percentage ratio. After multiplication of 100, this ratio shown in the percentage. This ratio explains the relationship between total profits earned by the business and total investments made or total assets employed. Return on capital employed, this ratio measures the overall efficiency of the business operations. After calculation of return on capital employed, we can understand the overall efficiency of the business organization of the company. This ratio is known as, substitute wording or alternate name used for a return on capital employed is a return on total resources. Okay, capital structure constitute of two sources of funds. The first is the own capital and second is the loan capital. Own capital plus loan capital is equal to total investment that is invested in organization. Own capital includes shareholders funds, proprietors funds, and loan capital includes investment, debentures, bonds, bank loan, etc. At the time of preparation of vertical income statement, this is the liability side of the balance sheet, that is the own capital and loan capital. And at the time of preparation of vertical balance sheet, we have discussed about the various elements, various factors which is considered under the heading of own capital and loan capital. Own capital plus loan capital is also called a total investment, or this is known as the capital structure. For calculation of return on capital employed, two aspects are important. First is the net profit before tax and interest, and second is the capital employed. Net profit, this amount we will find out after preparation of the revenue statement, that is in vertical format or in horizontal format. Net operating profit will be the profit before taxes, depreciation, finance and interest charges, and other non-operating losses and non-operating incomes. Total operating assets before depreciation is taken as the denominator in that case. Capital employed. Capital employed means equity own capital. Own capital means equity share capital plus preference share capital plus undistributed profits plus reserves and surplus, that is the P&L account credit balance, less fictitious assets. Fictitious assets means miscellaneous expenses and losses, P&L account debit balance, etc. plus loan capital. Loan capital means long-term borrowings, that is debenture, bonds, bank loans, etc. Own capital is also known as the proprietors funds, net worth, the substitute word used for it, plus long-term loans. Fixed other, or this is the balance sheet liability side, own capital plus loan capital, that is the capital structure or capital employed. In angle of balance sheet, asset side, capital employed means fixed asset plus current assets less current liabilities, means fixed assets plus working capital, that is also known as the capital employed. This is our first combined ratio, that is the रिटर्न ऑन कॅपिटल एम्प्लॉयड. हा रेशो काय मेजर करत असतो बघा, तर जे काय आपला कंपनी असेल त्या कंपनीमध्ये आपण ओन कॅपिटल आणि लोन कॅपिटल जे काय इन्व्हेस्ट केलेलं आहे त्याच्यातून आपल्याला रिटर्न किती मिळाला, तर ते मेजर करण्याचं काम कोण करत असतो, हा रेशो करत असतो. ठीक आहे. तर सेकंड कंबाइंड रेशो इज return on proprietors fund. Return always calculated in the form of net profit, and in this ratio return calculated on proprietors fund. Proprietors fund means own fund. Proprietors fund is the own fund. It is also known as the net worth. Okay, and for calculation of return on proprietors fund, this ratio formula is used, that is net profit after tax and interest. Okay, for net profit distributed or paid to proprietors after payment of tax and interest. Interest is always paid on debenture, bonds and loan taken from the banks or loan taken from the financial institutions. Okay, that net profit we will consider at the time of return on proprietors fund. Net profit after tax and interest. फॉर्म्युले इम्पॉर्टंट आहेत, केअरफुली लिसन करा, राईट डाऊन करा आणि त्या पद्धतीनं काय करायचे ते फॉर्म्युले कंप्लीट करायचे. बघा, रिटर्न ऑन प्रोप्रायटर्स फंड फॉर्म्युला नेट प्रॉफिट आफ्टर टॅक्स अँड इंटरेस्ट डिवायडेड बाय प्रोप्रायटर्स इक्विटी. प्रोप्रायटर्स इक्विटी और प्रोप्रायटर्स फंड्स, and it is multiplied by 100. ऑपरेटिंग प्रोप्रायटर्स इक्विटी नेट प्रॉफिट आफ्टर टॅक्स अँड इंटरेस्टच्या ऐवजी आपण हे पण वर्डिंग यूज करू शकतो, ऑपरेटिंग प्रॉफिट डिवायडेड बाय प्रोप्रायटर्स इक्विटी into 100. This is the substitute formula that we can use for calculation of return on proprietors fund. Okay, a return on proprietors fund, this ratio also known as return on proprietors equity or return on shareholders investment or investors ratio. The above ratio indicates the relationship between net profit earned and total proprietors fund. Net profit. Net profit for the purpose of calculating the return on proprietors funds will be the net profit after tax, interest paid on secured and unsecured loans and finance expenses. Proprietors funds is the composition of proprietors funds is we have already discussed in the proprietary ratio. Proprietors funds, it includes equity share capital, preference share capital plus reserves and surplus less miscellaneous expenses and losses. This is the second ratio, a return on proprietors fund. Next combined ratio is a return on equity capital. This is third combined ratio, a return on equity capital. This ratio indicates the rate of earning on the equity or ordinary share capital. Equity share capital is also known as the ordinary share capital, and a return on ordinary share capital is calculated with the help of this ratio, that is the return on equity capital. This is expressed as a percentage or in absolute monetary terms. This may be expressed as an amount of return per equity share, but as a percent of the equity capital. It is easily understood. This ratio is also known as the rate of return on equity capital. And for calculation of return on equity capital, this formula is used: net profit after tax and preference dividend divided by paid up equity share capital into 100. बघा, रिटर्न ऑन इक्विटी कॅपिटल, इक्विटी कॅपिटल वरचा रिटर्न आपल्याला कॅल्क्युलेट करायचा आहे आणि आपल्याला माहिती आहे इक्विटी शेअर कॅपिटलना डिव्हिडंड पे करण्याच्या अगोदर प्रेफरन्स शेअर होल्डर्सना त्यांचा डिव्हिडंड पे केला जातो, बरोबर आहे ना. म्हणून फॉर्म्युला कोणता यूज केला जातो? नेट प्रॉफिट आफ्टर टॅक्स अँड प्रेफरन्स डिव्हिडंड divided by paid up equity share capital into 100, or second alternatively this formula is also used, that is net profit after tax less preference dividend, or net operating profit after tax and preference dividend divided by number of equity shares. And for calculation of return on equity capital, two components are important. First is the net profit after tax and preference dividend, and second is the paid up equity share capital. This rate of return also indicate the practice of trading on equity, and this ratio is also used to compare the performance of a company's equity capital with those of other companies. आपल्या इक्विटी शेअर कॅपिटलचा परफॉर्मन्स अदर कंपनीच्या परफॉर्मन्स बरोबर सुद्धा आपण काय करू शकत असतो? कंपेअर करू शकत असतो. त्याच्यासाठी हा रिटर्न ऑन इक्विटी कॅपिटल रेशो यूज केला जातो. नेक्स्ट, फोर्थ कंबाइंड रेशो इज डिव्हिडंड पेआउट रेशो. द पर्पज ऑफ धिस रेशो इज टू फाइंड आउट द प्रपोर्शन of earning used for payment of dividend and the proportion of earning retained. The ratio is a relationship between earning per equity share and dividend per equity share. And for the calculation of dividend payout ratio, the formula is used: dividend per equity share divided by earning per equity share. Dividend per equity share divided by earning per equity share. Or second formula is dividend to equity shareholders divided by profit available to equity shareholders into 100. Dividend to equity shareholders divided by profit available to equity shareholders into 100. Higher ratio signifies that the company has utilized a larger portion of its earning for payment of dividend to equity shareholders. It shows that lesser amount of earning has been retained. It shows how much of the earning per share is utilized for repayment of dividend. If the ratio is 30%, it indicates that out of every ₹100 profit available to equity shareholders, ₹30. ₹30 is paid as dividend and 70 is available for transfer to reserve. ओके, बघा, इक्विटी शेअर होल्डर्सना जे काही डिव्हिडंडचं पर्सेंटेज पे केलेलं असेल, तर समजा ते 30% असेल, तर त्याचा अर्थ काय होतो? आपला प्रॉफिट अर्निंग ₹100 आहे, त्याच्यातून आपण 30% डिव्हिडंड कुणाला देतो? इक्विटी शेअर होल्डर्सना. अँड रिमेनिंग 70 आपल्याकडे कशासाठी अवेलेबल आहेत? आपण ते रिझर्व्ह मध्ये केप्ट करू शकतो. रिझर्व्ह माहिती आहे, रिझर्व्हचं मिनिंग काय? पार्ट ऑफ द प्रॉफिट केप्ट असाइड फॉर अ स्पेसिफिक पर्पजेस और फॉर द जनरल पर्पजेस. जे फ्युचरमध्ये काही सर्कमस्टन्सेस क्रिएट होतात त्याच्यासाठी आपण तो काय करत असतो? प्रॉफिटचा पार्ट बाजूला काढून ठेवत असतो, त्याला आपण काय म्हणतो? रिझर्व्ह म्हणतो. ठीक आहे. तर बघा, आजच्या लेक्चरला आपण 4 रेशोज, कंबाइंड रेशोज बघितले. फर्स्ट रेशो कोणता बघितला बघा? फर्स्ट रेशो इज द रिटर्न ऑन return on capital employed. Second is the return on proprietors